Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching. I just want to say, first off, right off the bat, a big thank you to Dr. Silic and to everyone in the class for working with me during residency due to some health concerns and also starting two new jobs over the last couple of weeks. I just wasn't able to be over there this week due to some health concerns in my family. So I do want to say thank you very much and get that out of the way before we move on. With that being said, today, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be looking at the economic stimulus packages that have been proposed during the time of coronavirus, including the CARES, HEROES, HEALS, EMFTP, and MECS acts. And we'll end by asking a few ethical questions and concerns surrounding each of these bills that have been proposed as economic stimulus packages during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, just a brief introduction and background. As we all know, in February of 2020, the United States was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses, schools, and churches were all forced to close, and there were strict social distancing measures that were put in place to stop the spread of the virus. Shortly after the crisis began, Congress passed the bipartisan CARES Act in response to the economic crisis that resulted from COVID-19, and that bill was signed into law by President Trump in March of 2020. As the pandemic now has been continuing into August, we see more than 180,000 reported COVID-19 deaths, and the unemployment rate continues to hover at right around 10.2%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Most economists and most American citizens agree that another stimulus package is needed. However, despite the urgency of the situation, the federal government has been quite slow to respond. What exactly is the holdup, and why is it taking so long for them to pass another stimulus package? Well, in order to understand that, we first have to look at the political background surrounding the various stimulus packages that have been proposed. Political disagreements over what to include in the next round of stimulus stem largely from disagreements between the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives and the Republican-controlled Senate over what to include in the next stimulus package. Now, the key here is that both parties actually agree on another round of direct payments to American citizens. As most of you will recall, in the first stimulus package, it was $1,200 for each adult and $2,400 for married couples, with $500 allocated for each dependent child. The disagreement then is over what else to include besides those direct payments. The House of Representatives passed the HEROES, or Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, in May of 2020. This was followed up in July when the Senate, led by the Republican Party, introduced the HEALS, or Health, Economic Assistance, Liability, and Schools Act, in July of 2020. Before looking at the differences between these two packages, let's just take a moment and look over the original CARES Act that was passed back in March. Now, the CARES Act, or Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, was passed and signed into law of March of 2020. It included $2.2 trillion in total funding. It included direct payments of $1,200 per each individual adult, $2,400 per each married couple, and $500 per dependent child. In addition to this, it also included $600 in additional federal unemployment benefits paid out each week to those who lost their jobs due to the COVID-19 pandemic, $659 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses, a 50% employee tax credit, and it banned evictions until July of 2020. There were actually a lot of other provisions in there, but these are the key ones that most people are familiar with, and that actually, the disagreements that have spurned between the new bills that have been proposed largely stem from disagreements over these areas here. So let's take a look at HEROES versus HEALS. Now, one of the big concerns has been the amount of funding. Democrats have pushed for a larger $3 trillion package, while Republicans have pushed for a smaller $1 trillion package. Both the HEROES and HEALS Act allocate $1,200 per individual and $2,400 per married couples. When we look at the amounts for dependents, this is where we see our first difference. The HEROES Act allows for $1,200 for each additional dependent with a maximum of 3 children. And the HEALS Act calls for $500 for each dependent. Another key here is that the HEROES Act, and it continues the $600 unemployment payments through 2021 and expands them to include gig workers, independent contractors, part-time workers, and the self-employed. The Republican HEALS Act, on the other hand, only allows for a $200 per week bonus through December, and then it goes to 70% matching of lost wages. Another big difference between the two bills is that the HEROES Act does not include a return to work bonus of up to $450 per week for unemployed workers, while the HEALS Act does include that $450 per week bonus for unemployed workers who secure a new job or are rehired. Another big disagreement here also includes the moratorium on evictions. Now, that ran out under the CARES Act in July. The HEROES Act expands the moratorium on evictions to cover nearly all rental properties in the United States and extends eviction moratorium an additional 12 months. Plus, it allocates $200 billion for housing programs and another $100 billion for rental assistance. The Republican HEALS Act does not address the housing situation. Another big difference here is in terms of educational funding. And also, the HEALS Act includes a 5-year liability shield for businesses and a $16 billion to go towards coronavirus testing. Now, it's important to note that neither one of these bills are meant to be final bills. Basically what happened was the Democrats came out with a bill. They said, this is what we want. The Republicans came out with a bill and said, this is what we want. And the idea here is that the parties would meet in the middle and come with a compromise solution, which is what happened when CARES was passed back in March. But there's been a lot of stalemating and just the bill's not really been going anywhere. There are also 2 other bills that are on the table, and these are not given nearly as much attention as HEROES and HEALS, but they're worth taking a look at. The EMFTP and MECS Acts are what might be called Emergency Pilot Universal Basic Income Acts. The Emergency Money for the People and Monthly Economic Crisis Support Acts are somewhat different from both HEALS and HEROES. The only thing that they focus on is direct payments to families and individuals for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis. They are largely identical. They allow $2,000 per individual per month, $4,000 per married couple, and $2,000 per dependent child. The MECS Act, it might be worth noting, is sponsored by Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris. The EMFTP Act includes direct payments in the same amount as the MECS Act, with payments phasing out for those who earn more than $130,000 per year. The EMFTP Act is the Congressional Act, and the MECS Act is the Senate Act. So keep in mind that these bills here do not focus on anything other than direct payments. There is no additional provisions included in these bills. So here are a few ethical questions for discussion and consideration based upon these bills. Does the federal government have an ethical responsibility to provide support to individuals and families affected by the COVID-19 crisis? Or do you take a more libertarian stance on that discussion? Do direct payments to individuals and families lead to a disincentive to contribute to the economy through labor? In other words, do these sorts of stimulus packages lead people not to return to the workforce? And if so, is that a good or bad thing given that we are in a pandemic that continues to claim the lives of our fellow citizens every day? Should people be incentivized to work, or should people be incentivized to stay home? Given the bills that are outlined in this presentation, HEALS, HEROES, EMFTP, and MECS, Which approach seems best from a utilitarian direction? Which approach seems best from a human rights approach? And lastly, if you were a member of Congress, which of these stimulus plans, if any, would you support? Or would you support another stimulus plan altogether, one that contains a mix of the approaches outlined in the bills discussed? If you would support a mixture of these bills, what would you take into consideration to make that decision, and which portions of these bills would you support? Which portions would you not support? And what sort of ethical considerations would you take into consideration when you made your decision and when you were a member of Congress writing these bills? Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing the discussion and conversation that comes from this. Thank you.